to their philosophy. Your book says that the Chinese apparently were very religious during their early time, Neolithic times, and then the old ways fell into disuse. Into this chaos, this period of chaos, came a man Confucius. This is the name Confucius, the name he's known to by us. In Chinese it's pronounced a little bit differently, but even though that's close, even to Chinese. But Confucius went around from one nobleman to another throughout the realm of China looking for a government job, and he never got one. But in his travels, he would preach his doctrines, and he collected a lot of disciples. Again, these philosophers collecting disciples was a common practice in those days. Socrates collected the disciples, so did Plato, and so did Aristotle, so did Jesus and Confucius. These men would, this was before the university existed, so these men would go around and collect people who wanted to learn, and they would sit at the feet of this great teacher. Confucius died somewhat disappointed that he never had gotten a government job, but once he was gone, again, a lot of people are more honored after they're dead than they are alive. In our own history, one prime example was Abraham Lincoln, who was, while he was alive, was called an idiot, and imbecile on a whole lot of other uncomplimentary terms. Then after he died, he was elevated on a pedestal right next to George Washington, and a big monument, a big memorial was set up to him. His picture was put on the penny, the $5 bill, the most circulated of coins, and a highly circulated bit of paper money. But anyway, Confucius was elevated. All right, what did he teach? His teaching, in effect, emphasized not the spiritual, not the hereafter, but the material, the here and now, the practical. How we should live, how we should conduct ourselves toward the state, how we should conduct ourselves toward our family, how we should conduct ourselves toward our village, and how we should conduct ourselves, well, toward our ancestors. Practical. Now, as far as religion, Confucius' ideas have been called a philosophy more than a religion. It is not even known if Confucius believed that there is a God, or if he even believed in the spirit world. His views were very extremely materialistic, with almost no spiritual content whatever. His life overlapped Socrates about 8 years, but right now I can't think of which one might have been older. But he was at least a contemporary of Socrates. One of them was 8 years old when the other one died. And some people have wondered if somehow, if one of the teachings of the older one might not have influenced the other one. Again, we don't know. The records just simply are not there. And we don't know if the name of Socrates ever reached China or if Confucius' name ever reached Greece. Now, Confucianism was to be the dominant philosophy of China from shortly after the time he died until the year 1949, when Confucianism was replaced by communism. Your book opens up by saying that the Chinese civilization is the only civilization that actually survived intact until the 20th century. And early in the 20th century, things came along that shook up the Chinese, and they wound up destroying the office of emperor, and then wound up abandoning Confucianism. You might say, well, what about Egypt? Well, the Egypt culture was changed from the old Egyptian gods to Christianity, and from Christianity to Islam. So you can't say it survived intact. But in the case of China, they survived intact. Their civilization survived intact under the leadership of Confucius, you might say, in his philosophy, from about 300 BCE until 1949. And as the Chinese are beginning to question communism, a lot of them are going back to Confucianism because Confucius' emphasis on family loyalty, loyalty to the state, and hard work, none of which I personally have a quarrel with. Now, something else about his teaching will lead to the next man I'll talk about. The Chinese word Dao, sometimes spelled Tao, there's no accurate English translation of that word. The best translation of that word in English is way. Confucius believed that everybody had his own way. In other words, if this person, now this is extreme, he did not actually teach this, but if this person's way was to go out and steal things, well, that was just his way, let him do it. Now, he didn't go quite to that extreme. No, but I'm using that to emphasize the point. He believed that, well, he noticed this person, he likes to do things this way. That person likes to do things that way. So why is this person to say that his Dao is any better than anyone else? So let everyone have his own Dao. I mean, up to a certain point. I mean, granted, you cannot allow murderers, you cannot allow thieves, but up to a certain point, let everyone have his own Dao, or his own way. He also believed that the rulers governed by the consent of the governed, and Thomas Jefferson definitely would have agreed with him, that you have a rulership only as long as the people will it. And then when the people don't will that ruler be ruler anymore, they have the right to overthrow it. Or like Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, it's the duty of the people to alter or abolish their government. He believed in government by talent. In other words, if a nobleman died, should the office that he held go to his oldest son, or go to his most qualified relative, or go to someone who is not even a member of his family who is more qualified. He believed that it should go to the person who is most qualified and not necessarily stay in a family. And this was to lead to the Chinese practice of the civil service exam, which some people consider the China's greatest gift. The civil service exam, where that you would take a test, and this test would determine whether or not you were qualified for a government position. Now, I had a student ask me one time, how do you know that a person can make a good grade on a test that's good as a government office? And folks, that's an extremely good question, extremely good observation. Not necessarily so, folks. But again, they believe that if you could qualify for, if you do well on one of their tests, you can qualify. Now, don't think for a minute now that everybody was equal in this exam, because keep in mind, only the upper classes were educated, which meant your ordinary person had almost no chance to pass because he never learned how to read.
And it was expensive.
What's that?
And it was expensive.
It was expensive, yes. But now, folk, and I heard someone on a talk show say this just last week, and it's something I've said for years. There was a big problem with the civil service exam also. And that is, they were slanted towards Confucian philosophy. Now, you had to memorize large portions of Confucius's writings in order to be able to pass the test. And they might say, well, what if you were a Taoist? You had no chance. Now, folk, this didn't get me in trouble, but I said this it's been about 8 years ago. I said this in class, what I'm about to say. And someone went right straight to the part of my head at that time and told on me. If you want to do that, fine. Here's what I'm about to say. In America today, our higher up tests, and I'm talking about GRE tests and National Teacher Exam, are slanted toward the left. If you don't like what I'm saying, you're welcome to tell me now. If you haven't noticed it yet, you will later. If you're taking these tests and the answer that appears to be the most liberal, you might better pick that. That way they're guaranteed to keep the left in power as much as possible. They're standing towards socialism, toward leftism, towards political correctness. We're doing the same thing that they did back then. At least some of you appear to start paying attention all of a sudden, but yes. All right, anyway, I'll move on. There was another problem now with the civil service exam. Also had a few other problems in that it's known that there was cheating, and again, only the richer people could afford tutors for their sons to pass, and it did go a long way toward keeping the upper classes still in control. But it did give some upward mobility. And also, yeah, there was another problem. Some people say that the reason the Chinese never advanced farther was everything you amounted to depended on a government position, how high you got in the government bureaucracy. Or in our society today, I mean, a woman can make the top by being an athlete, a musician, an artist, without ever having a government job. A scientist. There's all kinds of ways you can find a fulfilling, useful life. But in China, no, everything you did was to lead toward a government position, and the higher up the better. And what about their scientists? They didn't have that many of them. What about their merchants? They frowned on them. What about their philosophers? Their philosophers wound up ruining them, with all due respect. I mean, that's more for a later chapter. But, again, this was some of the weak, so it wasn't a cure-all, it wasn't perfect in a way to pick government officials. In fact, we today still don't know what is the best way to pick a government official. All right. As Confucius' ideas were adopted by the emperors, a dynasty came on the scene that said that Confucius' ideas should be put into practice rigidly, and these were the legalists. Now, all right, here's basically what legalism teaches. Confucius said that man was basically good. Legalism teaches that man is basically bad. And the only way you can keep mankind from being evil is to have a strong government that enforces rules rigidly and lays out very, very rigid, harsh punishment toward the offenders. And basically, the government, the ruler, should rule by fear. Everybody should be afraid to, now, hey, I'm only teaching this, not